Hello, everyone. Sorry to disturb your conversations. Thank you so much for coming for the second to last Big Questions of term. We really want this to be a space where you can chat about what you think, chat about whether you think God is arrogant, that's our topic today, whether you think he's not and why. But before we have those conversations and ask those questions together, we're privileged to have Seidel here to give a talk from the Christian's perspective of whether God is arrogant to expect worship. So if you could join me in welcoming up Seidel, and then he'll come up to speak. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. And the big question for us today is, isn't God arrogant to expect worship? Is actually a big question. I don't think so I can do justice in the next 20, 25 minutes to this question, but I am available after the talk, so if you'd like to ask any questions, there will be a Q&A time, and also I'll be here to answer to my best of my ability any questions you may have. So I thought the best way to address this particular question, isn't God arrogant to expect worship, is to actually carefully analyze three big words in this question. Let's see. There we go. Worship, arrogance, and expectation or demand. So let's look at the first one, worship. You see, worship as a word comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of church traditions, religious traditions, liturgies, scripture reading, songs. It'll be helpful to strip out these different tags from worship to see what does worship in a very simple definition actually means. The English word worship actually comes from the word worthship. Worthship. So someone who is worshiping sees that the object of worship or the person of worship has worthy of praise. So it doesn't have to have the whole baggage of worship, but it just means the person or the object has some worth that they can adore or praise that thing or a person. And worship is a feeling of reverence and adoration to that particular person or thing. So please keep that thought at the back of your mind as we move on. This morning, I spent some time at Cambridge Center for World Christianity, and I was browsing through some of the books on sociology of religion, and 3 or 4 books that I picked up, the readers, they tell you, that sociologists will tell you, that the kind of worship that we see never began all of a sudden. It evolved gradually over centuries. So people started worshiping maybe a supernatural being called God, or they started worshiping some created things in the world, and slowly they added the rituals, the practices, the ceremonies, and that's how we get to whatever worship is in today's practice. Now, the point I want to make is, forgot about this. There you go. Everything is on here. Third point, worship does not necessarily need to be a religious term. Every person is a worshiper in some form or fashion. Now, think about celebrity worship. Fans love whoever they are, pop stars or sports personalities. They love and adore them. Did you know there is something called as celebrity worship syndrome? CWS. It's a medical term. I'm not making this up. It's a medical term. Celebrity worship syndrome. It's an obsessive addictive order in which a person, a celeb, becomes involved with the details of a celebrity's personal and professional life. They only think about that person all the time. And those people are categorized with CWS, celebrity worship syndrome. There are some people, look at the choice of the word these psychologists have used, worship syndrome. And I've read some of the bizarre kind of things some people with celebrity worship syndrome have taken things too far. 3 quick examples. South Korean pop idol received a letter of admiration written in the blood of the fan. Another example, a Hollywood actor, Jared Leto, received a fan's literal ear as a gift. Celebrity worship syndrome makes sense? And finally, actually 2 weeks ago, I heard of a man who spent like thousands of dollars, I think, on getting plastic surgery done so that he could look like Superman. Celebrity worship syndrome. So people, whether it's not, so worship is not just necessarily a religious term. It could be applied to non-religious categories as well. So anything that is worthy of praise, worthy of praise. So essentially everyone worships something or the other, not necessarily a supernatural being. So now the big question that we have assumes the context is a religious one because it uses the word God in that question and believes that this God who expects or demands worship is an arrogant one. So let's unpack that statement carefully as we move on. There you go, celebrity worship syndrome. Would it be possible to put the screen on these TVs as well so I can not turn every time? Oh, wonderful, there we go. So we looked at the word worship. Now we'll look at the word arrogance. Now, we live in a world where we talk about equal opportunities all the time. Equal status. We as a society believe in social equality. So social equality means that all residents in a particular society have equal status in the society. They should not be discriminated. Especially, there should be no distinction in terms of caste, creed, religion, language, color, gender, race, sexuality. There should be no distinction. They should be treated as equals. And this is a good thing. This equality, consciously or subconsciously, has been ingrained in our minds. With that equality as the backdrop, if I ask someone walking on the street, please worship me because I am Seidel. Imagine their reaction to me. They'll probably give me a weird look and say, what's wrong with you? I say, I am Seidel, worship me now. And that person might go, okay, you are Seidel, I am Sam, so what? We are both humans and equal. And that person might walk away thinking that I have some kind of mental problem. And that person will also tell me that, Seidel, look, praise or worship or adoration should be voluntarily given. Because of some merit in you, you should achieve something or do something, okay? Say I achieved something, a gold medal or an invention, or I created a beautiful piece of art, and I ask people, look at my work, now praise me. They will still think I'm weird, right? They will say that praise should be voluntary again. You can't demand praise. If you still insist, oh, please praise me, I have put so much hard work on this. And then that person will tell me that I'm arrogant, big-headed, or like an egomaniac. You see, the problem with our big question, isn't God arrogant to demand or expect worship? We are applying that same equality criteria to God and then raise that particular question. You see, the concept of seeking self-glory sounds far from being good or virtuous. Actually, it sounds quite selfish. And then we raise this question, isn't God arrogant to expect worship? Because we are applying our equality rules to God. But my point that I want to make is, we cannot compare a creator God with the created humanity, or impose our finite human criteria to an infinite divine being called God. Let me unpack that and explain. Here is my point. Just because something is wrong for us, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong to somebody else, let alone God. I'll repeat that. Just because something is wrong for us, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong for somebody else, a fellow human being, let alone God. For example, by the virtue of one's office or their nature or their character, different people have different freedoms. And we need to understand that. Different people have different freedoms. For example, kids, they have early bedtimes. Parents don't. Doctors, some doctors have the authority to check your private parts. Strangers shouldn't, and they can't. For instance, military general, a male military general requires a subordinate to call him sir and salute the flag. Is that arrogance? Or does it come by the office that the person holds? Take, for example, Her Majesty the Queen. She has many powers and authority that we don't have. For example, she can do many things that we can't do. She can drive without a driver's license in the UK. You do that, you get arrested. Speed limits does not apply to the Queen. Not that she drives, but speed limits don't apply. You do that, you'll get a hefty fine. And she does not need a passport to travel because the passports are issued in her name. So she can't have herself above herself. So she doesn't have a passport. You travel without a passport, you will get deported. She has immunity against prosecution, but we don't. A person who raises the question, isn't God arrogant to expect worship, does not go to the Queen and say, how arrogant are you, Your Majesty, that you expect us to treat you in such a special way? We don't do that because the role and her office requires that. Even Republicans or MPs who do not have a dislike for monarchy still respect the Queen when she enters the Parliament. The point I'm trying to make here is just because something is wrong for us doesn't mean it's wrong for other fellow human beings, let alone God, but we are trying to apply the social equality criteria from a sociological perspective to an infinite God. So that is my first problem with the question. God is not a limited, finite creature like us, where it would be indeed prideful or arrogant to say, worship and praise me. He transcends our human criteria. In fact, the right way to relate to a God is actually worship. Let me explain that. I mean, some people might raise a question on, I don't have a problem with worshiping God, but when I look at all the evil and suffering in the world, how can I worship a God who actually allows this kind of evil and suffering? Oh, that's gone. There you go. Evil and suffering. I think a few months ago you had a full big question talk on why does God allow suffering, so I can't explain this in the next one sentence or two, but I'll happily take any questions that you have later. But I want to mention this, especially when we raise these big questions about evil and suffering. Most of the suffering that we see in this world is caused by fellow human beings to fellow human beings. Actually, I'll make a case that true worship is the only way to get rid of that kind of suffering. I'll explain that in a minute. But suffering exists because I believe that God has given humanity a free will to choose so that the person can choose to love God or reject God. You cannot have love without rejection. So whatever we are looking at, the evil and suffering between fellow human beings, why doesn't God stop all of these? Is because he cannot violate a freedom that he himself has given to us in the first place. I'll unpack that later in the Q&A or after our discussions. So we looked at worship, arrogance, and then expectation and demand. Here is where it gets really tough and difficult. Here we come to the difficult questions or verses in the Bible. Yes, I admit, there are verses in the Bible where God appears to be expecting or demanding worship. In fact, he does more than just demand worship. He gives very precise instructions on how he should be worshipped. then you might say, oh boy, he is so arrogant, he is so demanding. But what we need to do with these verses, for example, this one on the screen here, Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 to 5, you shall not have any other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Oh boy, jealousy with God? It's quite a troubling verse, actually, Exodus 20, 3 to 5. But like I said, we have to interpret that in its actual context. What was happening around that time? The moment you take that verse out of its context, then God clearly appears to be arrogant and demanding. But if you read that in context, it's actually a just statement. Let me illustrate that for you. Let's say, how many artists are in this audience? Any artist? No artists at all? Okay, here is a difficult task. Imagine you are an artist. You spent 8 months creating a beautiful piece of work. Maybe something like this. You spent 8 months. This is your original creation that you made. And your art was put on display, say in the local town hall. Some people came to it. Maybe you're in some corner somewhere. Some people came to it and they appreciated your work. And you were a very proud person. You were happy that you created something beautiful such as this portrait. It was covered well in the media as well. And you had a good night's rest. In the morning, you woke up and you opened your local newspaper. And the first line you see is some writer wrote that your magnificent, beautiful piece of art was actually plagiarized or copied from somewhere else. You get really upset, don't you? And you see another paper and they say, actually a friend of yours made that work, you're actually taking credit for it. You get upset. And another person might have claimed that this piece actually doesn't exist, it's just a rumor. So very upset and angry, you call up the media people and you talk to the media people. And the media people will tell you that you're arrogant for claiming a piece of art that you never painted in the first place. No? I did it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. No, you're wrong. They'll tell you that you're selfish to take credit for someone else's work. And another person said that you are so evil for painting the way you did because the best way to paint the painting is according to that person. What would you do? At that point, you're raising your voice. The reality, people, is that I painted this portrait. I spent 8 months in designing and creating this thing. I know the hard work that was involved in it. Please listen, people. I painted it. I did it. Now think about this. When you're demanding them to listen to you, are you arrogant? Or are you trying to get them to see the things that they really are? Trying to communicate the actual truth behind the so-called scenario that these people have created. You see, human beings are instinctively worshiping creatures. Instinctively worshiping creatures. We worship something or the other. If you say, I know that celebrities don't demand worship, but think about this. If there's a celebrity called Sam, and you give the credit that belonged to Sam to, say, someone called Jack, then Sam will get angry. Sam will tell you off. Sam will lead you to the truth and the reality. He wants you to know the truth. That is exactly what was happening with those verses from Exodus. These Israelites saw the 10 great miracles of God in Egypt. They witnessed God's power. They saw with their own eyes the Red Sea being divided. Actually, in the Bible, you see there's another city called Jericho. When they heard about this Red Sea being divided, they were all scared because of the Israelites. But they saw by themselves, they witnessed God's power, and what did these people do? They created a golden calf as soon as they crossed over and started worshiping this idol. And God got upset. And that's why God said, you shall not have any other, that's part of the 10 Commandments. You shall not have any other gods before me. Because I am the Lord, I am a jealous God. Someone once asked me, how can God have jealousy? But we have to carefully understand that word jealousy, because jealousy in our context is used to communicate feelings like insecurity, fear, anger, rage. But there could be something called as godly jealousy. And I don't have time to go into this jealousy, but let me tell you this. If something does not belong to you and you want that, that is jealousy. That is evil jealousy. If something that rightfully belongs to you, but you don't have, but you long for it, that is godly jealousy. Think about it in these terms. If a husband sees another man flirting with his wife, he's right to be jealous, because only he has the right to flirt with his wife. This type of jealousy is not sinful, but it's actually appropriate. So, when God deserves worship, rightfully worship belongs to God, but they were taking away what belonged to God and were giving to others. That is not wrong jealousy, that is right jealousy. And then, let's just move on. I'll try and conclude. So they made the golden calf, jealous God. And now I'll speak from a Christian worldview and conclude. You see, God is a God of aseity. He doesn't have any needs. He doesn't need us to worship him so that we can fulfill some of his needs of his psychological profile. It's not that. He asks us to worship him because of us, because it's helpful for us to worship him. Now, what do I mean by that? You see, there's a book called the Westminster Catechism. It's, in simple words, it's a summary of Christian doctrine. And in that, the first question is, what is the chief end of humanity? This is the first question, and the answer to that is the chief end of humanity is to worship, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That is the foundation of the Christian worldview. According to the Christian faith, we were created to be in constant communion with God and in a relationship with God, worshiping God. The Christian definition of worship is quite radically different from other world religions. You see, one of the best definitions of worship is this, given by the Archbishop William Temple. It's quite wordy, but just stay with me. It says, the submission of all worship is the submission of all our nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by his holiness, the nourishment of mind by his truth, the purifying of imagination by his beauty, the opening of the heart to his love so that we could love, the surrender of our will to his purpose. All of this is gathered up in adoration, the most selfless emotion of which our nature is capable. You see, Christian worship is not just some happy clappy songs in a church for 2-3 hours. Christian worship is a lifestyle. It's about doing our jobs properly, getting married, being faithful to our spouse, having children, raising them in a godly way, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Paul, who is one of the authors of a few books in the Bible, says this in one of the books, whatever you do, whether you eat or you drink, do it all for the glory of God. Do it all for the glory of God. Think about this. Christian worship actually should help us to become more like Jesus. And that's what Christian worship does, because you're constantly trying to be conformed into the image of the one whom you're worshiping. In that sense, actually, wars will end, hate will end, conflicts will end. Worshipping God is to bring us joy and to change us. This is completely opposite of arrogance or insecurity. When you recognize that by worship we actually fulfill our purpose, then it's actually right that God demands worship of us because he wants the best out of us and to fulfill our purpose. And the only way that we can truly worship God is when we can worship God in spirit and in truth, in relationship with him. That again comes through knowing a person called Jesus Christ. It is through that relationship we can worship God truly in the way that he wants us to be, to relate with him. And then that worship that quickening of the conscience, that purifying of the heart, developing that unconditional love comes out of our worship. That's how we become more Christ-like. So, you have an option. You may say that I completely disagree with your talk, Seidel. That's absolutely fine. You have a right to disagree with me. But we can do that with gentleness and respect. But if you are a person who is in that middle ground, I'm not sure, but I have this, and this particular questions that really trouble me, and I want to find out where are the answers for these, then please do come and speak to any of us here in the CU or to me as well, and we'll try our best. We are not saying that we have answers to all the world's problems, but we'll try our best. Or let's sit down and discern the will of God for both of us, and especially for these questions. So, we looked at worship, we looked at arrogance, we looked at this expectation. It's right that God expects because it's for our own benefit. So to conclude, is God arrogant to expect worship? No. God deserves worship because he's a God worthy of praise by himself because of what he has done in this world, created us. He actually gives us a way for restoration rather than anything else. So worship fulfills our purpose of existence.
Fab. If you could just draw those conversations to a close. And we'll go to questions texted in. So we've got one here, Seidel, saying, you talked about worship not being always religious and the fact that people worship celebrities. I don't worship the religious God or celebrities. I don't feel like I worship anything. What do you have to say to that?
Okay. I don't know who asked this question, but I'd like to ask more questions on that. If you don't think that you believe in a supernatural being or you don't worship anything, including a celebrity, what takes most of the time of your own time? That's one thing I would like to ask. What is that idea that you're passionate about, or a person that you're passionate about, or a person that you appreciate and you like that person for whatever qualities that the person portrays? What I wanted to do, defining that worship, was to look at the actual meaning of worship. By stripping all the different kinds of religious baggage around it, it's basically worthy of praise. So if you appreciate anything, you're looking at the worth of something and you praise that thing. So that is the actual meaning of worship. But if you put in the contemporary meaning of worship with all the religious baggage, then of course it's not exactly the same. But in essence, if you're giving appreciation to something that's worth or worthy, then in fact you are performing worship there. So that's the point that I wanted to communicate, that every person, whether you appreciate anything that we look at in the world, if you don't appreciate literally anything in the world, then maybe people might call a person like that a cynic, or thinking that there are some things that in the world that need appreciation. If you don't get appreciation to that, it means that basically it doesn't have any worth at all. So it is actually arrogant to say it doesn't have any worth at all when most of the people have actually given worth to it. So the original question, people worship or give worth or praise or adoration to anything, they're actually doing worship when we strip the whole religious baggage. So that's what I mean by it.
Great. Does anyone want to come back from that, or does anyone have any other questions from the floor?
There's a question ready here.
Yeah, just wait for a microphone.
Oh.
Just so everyone else can hear.
Does that mean then...
Okay, I'll repeat your question. Go ahead.
Does that mean that Christians can't appreciate things of this world that seem like they're directly not God, in terms of like, if worship is giving appreciation to something, does that mean that Christians can't appreciate?
Right, I'll just repeat the question for the others. If worship is only to God, can Christians not appreciate anything else that's in the world? Absolutely not. They can appreciate everything else, but the definition of worship according to the Christian worldview is different. It's not just appreciation. That's why I read that lengthy quote of worship. Actually, worship, in Christian worship, we become like the one whom we are worshiping. So there's more involved in Christian definition of worship, but Christians can appreciate whatever they want to appreciate. So I'm not imposing anything on that. So, yeah.
Okay. And finally, a question from me before we finish, if there weren't any more. You talked about worshipping God and worshipping this person you described called Jesus, so that we could become more like God in our character, and that would lead to sort of better living. What if we don't want to be like God or be like this person called Jesus? Why would we want to model his character?
Excellent question. If you don't want to be like Jesus in the character, absolutely, you have a choice. You can reject this particular worldview or this particular position. But from a Christian worldview point, the purpose of our existence is to be in communion with God. And if that is something I don't want you to miss, you feel free to reject it, but I highly encourage you, give it a try. At least give it a try, rather than not even trying it because it's not worthy. Give it a try and see. But you have an opportunity to reject it. That's no problem. But if you reject it, I believe that you'll be missing on a lot of beautiful things in life in general that only comes in a relationship with the Godhead. So that would be my response.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. I'm available after this, so I'll be happy to take any more questions. So thank you.